I discovered 2 armed compliance officers standing in the heart of my vineyard at dawn. The issue is, my property isn't part of their association, not remotely. 72 hours later, drones materialized over my homestead. Then came the cyber intrusions and a phony deputy named Gary insisting he held sway over my acreage. So I laid a snare, one crafted specifically for his arrogance. And when Gary stormed onto my land, slashing open a sack he was certain held narcotics, its contents detonated in his face. That's when the restraints were finally applied. Daybreak has a specific quality when it touches my soil. Gradual, gentle, almost contrite, as if it's treading lightly through the grapevines to avoid disturbing the world before its moment. That morning was no exception. The horizon was a serene canvas of amber, and the rows of Cabernet leaves glistened with moisture that resembled a scattering of finely crushed crystal. It was tranquil, the kind of serenity a man learns to cherish after enough years. I had just finished securing the trellis wire along the southern row, listening to the faint crunch of parched earth awakening under my work boots, when I registered an anomaly. A form, 2 forms to be precise. Dark outlines standing motionless in the center of my field, as if they held the deed. Initially, I assumed they were hikers who had strayed from the path, or perhaps overzealous birdwatchers who had misread a map. But hikers don't move with that kind of tactical caution, and birdwatchers most certainly do not carry sidearms. I halted, one hand still on the post, allowing my vision to fully adjust. 2 men in matching uniforms of a dark navy blue. Not quite police issue, not quite private security. Firearms were holstered on their hips, in cheap, ill-fitted rigs with the retention straps positioned incorrectly. On their sleeves was the most absurd emblem I'd witnessed in all my days. A patch designed to mimic a badge, but instead of a star or eagle, it featured a small printed pine tree and the words Pinecrest Grove Community Compliance Unit. Community Compliance Unit. I nearly chuckled aloud. Instead, I felt my jaw clench because Pinecrest Grove, the homeowners association those patches represented, was situated a quarter-mile down the lane, nestled behind its immaculate wooden signage, its uniformly painted homes, and its stringent regulations concerning exterior decor. My land was not, had never been, and would never be part of it. I stepped forward, my boots grinding softly in the soil. The 2 figures finally turned, noticing me as if for the first time. One lifted a clipboard. The other adjusted his belt, a clear attempt to draw attention to the weapon he was likely not certified to carry. "Morning," the taller one said. He wore sunglasses, had a square jaw, and a military short haircut. But his posture was off, leaning too far forward, knees locked. A less discerning man might mistake it for confidence. I recognized it as someone straining to portray a role for which he was untrained. "What are you doing on my property?" I asked. The tall one smiled the way a person does when they believe bureaucracy is their shield. "Routine perimeter assessment," he stated. "Part of the HOA's community safety program." I stood for a moment, letting the words hang in the air like mist. Then I did laugh, a quiet, genuine sound of disbelief. "This land isn't part of any HOA. Never has been, never will be." The 2 exchanged a glance, not one of embarrassment. No, it was the look men share when they believe the individual before them doesn't comprehend how the system truly operates. "Sir," the tall one began again, "your acreage borders our community. That grants us secondary jurisdiction for security evaluations. Secondary jurisdiction? I repeated. Is that the new term for trespassing? His smile vanished, but his partner stepped forward, tapping a button on the chest of his vest as if activating a body camera. Except the camera was a generic model, strapped on backward, with a blinking red light that indicated it wasn't recording. These men weren't officers. They were performers who didn't know their script. Something ancient stirred within me, a part I thought I'd retired years ago. The part that used to enter rooms full of people lying to my face and had to determine who would be featured on the evening news and who would be making a court appearance the next morning. I didn't introduce myself or reveal my past. It was unnecessary. I simply pointed toward the gravel driveway. "Out," I said. The tall one blinked, startled that I wasn't participating in his little authority charade. "Sir, refusal to cooperate could—" "Out," I repeated, my tone sharper. He opened his mouth again, but I took one deliberate step forward first. The kind of step that ends a discussion. Both men faltered. Finally, they turned and walked off my land, muttering about documentation and non-compliance. When they reached the road, they paused, glancing back as if waiting for me to look away. I didn't, not until they were gone from sight. I exhaled slowly. In my experience, trouble rarely announces itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly. Soft footsteps, forced smiles, individuals pretending to be something they are not. As the sun crested the treetops, warming the vine tops, I couldn't shake the sensation that those two weren't the beginning. No, they were the precursor, the first tremor before the earthquake. I didn't anticipate seeing those imitation officers again, at least not so soon. But trouble dislikes traveling alone. It brings companions, and it brought me a particular one. 2 days after the initial inspection, I was securing a wooden brace near the frog gate when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. Slow, heavy, too heavy for a sedan, too slow for a delivery truck. That left one option: someone attempting to project importance. I straightened up, dusted off my hands, and watched an aging silver Tahoe crawl to a halt just beyond my property line. The engine idled. The driver's door opened with the groan of an American SUV that had endured one too many seasons. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who had once been fit and now refused to acknowledge he wasn't. Aviator sunglasses, a jacket sporting a faded sheriff's department patch, clinging on by a few loose threads, as if the garment itself was undecided about retirement. He didn't survey the vineyard first. He looked directly at me, the kind of look a man gives when he's deciding between intimidation and outright domination. He walked toward the gate with a deliberate, heavy tread, boots thudding in the dirt. Halfway there, I noticed a telling detail. His right hand hovered near his hip every few steps. An old habit, a cop's habit, except the posture was all wrong. Too rigid, too rehearsed. Like a man struggling to recall a part he never played well, even when he legitimately held a badge. "Morning," he said, stopping just short of the fence. His voice was gravel wrapped in smoke. I nodded. "Can I help you?" He offered a thin, crooked smile, the kind practiced in a rearview mirror. "Name's Gary Wilson. I'm the community compliance captain for Pinecrest Grove." I didn't respond immediately. I simply looked at him, letting the title linger long enough for us both to appreciate its absurdity. "Community compliance captain," I repeated, keeping my expression neutral. "That's quite a title." His jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. I'd struck a nerve, which told me more than any introduction he could have given. He cleared his throat. "Your land orders our community. That places you under secondary HOA jurisdiction in the event of an emergency or safety concern." There it was again. Jurisdiction. The favorite word of men who no longer possess any. "My land isn't part of any HOA," I stated calmly. "Not yours, not anyone's. Never has been." Gary leaned forward slightly, placing a hand on the metal gate as if considering pushing it open. "You're close enough," he said. "Close enough that what happens here impacts us. Which means I get to inspect the premises when necessary." I stared at his hand on my gate before meeting his sunglasses. "This gate doesn't open for fictional titles," I said. "Only for legitimate law enforcement." He didn't appreciate that. His mouth tightened. His shoulders stiffened. He straightened his jacket, a muscle memory from stepping out of a patrol car. Except now, there was no badge, no real authority, just habit and a bruised ego. "You refusing an official safety inspection?" he asked. "I'm refusing a man in imitation authority gear, pretending to have power on my land," I replied. For the first time, Gary pushed his sunglasses onto his forehead. His eyes were pale, sharp, and filled with an anger that predated this moment. I'd seen that look before, in interrogations, in men who felt their badge slipping away and couldn't accept the loss. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Fine," he said. "But if something happens out here, anything, you remember I tried to keep things secure." "Secure for whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. He turned, walked back to his tonneau, and climbed in without another word. The door slammed, the engine revved, and the tires spat gravel as he sped off faster than a man with a point to prove should drive. I stood there for a long moment after he left, hands resting on the gate. I've dealt with liars, bullies, manipulators, and aspiring heroes. But there was something different about Gary. Something unhinged, simmering just beneath the surface. Not stupidity, not incompetence. Something else. A man who had lost genuine authority and had found a new sandbox to play in. And I had the distinct, unsettling feeling that Gary Wilson wasn't finished with me. Not by a long shot. Gary didn't return the next day. He didn't need to. Men of his ilk don't knock twice. They let the echo do their work. 2 mornings after his visit, I was repairing the hinge on my workshop door when a legitimate sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly up my driveway. The sight of an official patrol car didn't unsettle me. Law enforcement had been on my property many times over the years, usually for a glass of water or to ask about a lost dog. But the way this one stopped, the way the deputy stepped out with his shoulders already slumped and an apologetic expression already forming, told me this wasn't a social call. He adjusted his hat. "We received a report about a potential weapons violation on the premises." I stared at him. "On my premises?" He nodded like a man entering a conversation he'd rather avoid. "Caller stated there were firearms stored in public view. Thought it might pose a risk to the neighborhood." I almost asked if the caller's name rhymed with airy, but the deputy looked uncomfortable enough. Instead, I walked him to the workshop and pointed through the window. Inside, against the far wall, was my locked, bolted, steel gun cabinet, visible only from a specific angle if you peered through the glass. The deputy took one glance. "Yeah," he muttered. "That's not a violation at all." "I know," I said. He apologized sincerely, said he'd log it as unfounded, and expressed hope it wouldn't recur. It recurred, 48 hours later. This time, the call was about a potent alcohol odor permeating the neighborhood. a potent alcohol odor. I live on a vineyard. The scent of fermentation is literally carried on the summer air. The same deputy, even more apologetic than before. We stood in the driveway, listening to the hum of bees and the morning quiet. He ran a hand over his face as if wiping away secondhand embarrassment. "Look," he said, his voice low. "I'll be straight with you. Somebody's targeting you." I nodded. "I have a strong suspicion who." He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He departed, his tires carving slow lines in the dust. For a moment, I thought that might be the end of it, that the nuisance calls were just Gary's lazy attempt at provocation, the way some men toss stones at a fence just to hear the dogs bark. But bullies with a badge, or a badge-shaped fantasy, rarely stop at stones. They escalate. And the escalation arrived quietly, as trouble often does. I began noticing anomalies, shadows where none should be, fresh footprints along the fence line. A new HOA truck parked a little too long down the road. Neighbors walking their dogs would suddenly veer closer to my property, glancing at my house with an expression that wasn't curiosity, but wasn't friendliness either, as if they'd been told a story where I was the antagonist. Then the mail started. Folded flyers slipped into my box. Printed advisories about neighborhood safety concerns. One even claimed my property hosted non-compliant agricultural operations. On a vineyard I'd operated legally for years, I began documenting everything. Photographs, timestamps, video clips, an old habit resurfacing like a scar catching the light. And somewhere within me, a switch flipped. This was no longer random harassment. This was a pattern. Directed, coordinated, intentional. Gary wasn't merely on a power trip. He was constructing a narrative, painting me as a threat, a problem that needed to be managed. Perhaps he believed the pressure would make me capitulate. Perhaps he thought enough false reports would send me to the HOA's door, pleading for a resolution. He didn't know me. He didn't know I'd spent years as an investigator, listening to men spin tales they hoped were believable. Stories designed to conceal their true actions. Gary had that look. The look of someone straining to make his version of reality stick. And when a man like that doesn't get the reaction he wants, he doesn't retreat. He doubles down. As I walked the fence line that evening, the sun dipping behind the hills and the vines whispering in the wind, I felt it. A deep, certain, and cold realization. Gary Wilson had only just begun, and what he desired was control. He wasn't going to get it, but he was certainly going to try. I've always believed every property possesses its own unique silence. Mine used to be composed of wind through vines, the creak of aged wood, and the distant drone of cicadas. But by the week's end, a new element had infiltrated the quiet, a sensation of being observed. Not the obvious kind where someone stands at your fence, but the kind where you feel you're being watched, watching you. I first noticed it on a Tuesday evening just after sunset. A thin line of amber still clung to the ridge. I was carrying a coil of irrigation line back to the shed when a glint of fading light caught my eye. A metallic blink high above. I stopped mid-stride, tilting my head. There it was again, a tiny, misplaced star. But stars don't affix themselves to utility poles. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel, my breath steady. Rage induces carelessness, and legal proceedings take too long. Up close, The star resolved into a small, outdoor-rated bullet camera mounted higher than any homeowner would bother. Industrial screws, a cable neatly stapled down the pole, and on its side, a sticker featuring the same pine tree logo I'd seen on those fake uniforms. Pinecrest Grove Community Oversight Initiative. A farce. I didn't touch it. I didn't rip it down. Instead, I climbed the fence rail, steadied myself, and used my phone to photograph the serial number etched into the bracket. Then, I stepped back, changed angles, and documented the wiring path. Tools of my former trade. Evidence collection. Clean, controlled, quiet. On my return to the house, a breeze stirred the western trees. Just a soft push of air. And the leaves shifted just enough to reveal a second camera, half concealed in the branches, aimed directly at my porch. This one was an HOA-issued model, a different, cheaper brand. Gary's handiwork, undoubtedly. The angle, slightly downward, wide but not overly so, was precisely how a man who had spent too long pretending to be tactical would position a surveillance device. I stood beneath it for a full minute, motionless, staring directly into the lens, the way you lock eyes with a man through a two-way mirror. Let whoever was on the other end feel that. Let them feel me seeing them. A third camera appeared the next day, disguised in a cheap wildlife tracking housing. Except wildlife cameras point toward game trails. This one was fixed on the spot where I drink my morning coffee. 5 eyes in total. 5 tiny points of light blinking amber in the darkness whenever I stepped outside. So I established a ritual. Every night, around 9 p.m., I sat on the porch with a mug. It didn't matter if it contained hot coffee or chilled wine. The point was the routine. I sat with my back straight, face composed, and simply looked at them. Most people fear being watched, but watchers, true watchers, despise being acknowledged. It shatters their illusion of control. By Thursday, I was certain Gary was monitoring live feeds somewhere, perhaps his garage, perhaps a back room at the HOA office where he played sheriff after hours. Good, let him watch. Around midnight, after one of these quiet vigils, I returned it inside and pulled up my router logs. An old habit, an old instinct. At first glance, everything appeared normal. My outdoor lights, my server, my phone. But buried in the list was a device with an unrecognized MAC address. No label, no vendor tag, just a blank signature. It had connected for exactly 3 minutes at 2:14 a.m., then again the next night at 2:16 a.m., and the next at 2:13 a.m. Consistent, pattern. Someone probing, not yet attacking. Testing the door handle before employing a crowbar. I leaned back in my chair, gazing at the screen's glow. Amateurs spy out of curiosity. Professionals spy for control. And Gary? Gary was confused enough to believe he could be both. The vineyard groaned softly in the wind outside, vines brushing against one another like whispers. Another night, another silent challenge. And somewhere in the dark, behind a lens or a monitor, someone was watching. I closed the laptop gently. Let them watch. The more they observe, the more they reveal. And I was taking notes. The thing about pressure is it rarely arrives as a sledgehammer. Most times, it begins as a tap on the shoulder, or in my case, 2 taps. I heard the first one early Saturday morning. I was near the arbor, trimming an overgrown branch. When the sound echoed from the front gate, light, polite, excessively so, I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked up the path. 2 individuals stood there, a man and a woman, each wearing the sort of pastel polo shirt favored by HOA volunteers or realtors seeking to project authority. Clipboards in hand, rehearsed smiles, feet planted just shy of trespassing. "Good morning," the woman chirped, enunciating each syllable as if for an audition. "We're here conducting our routine environmental compliance review." Environmental compliance review. I nearly asked if they were lost on their way to a corporate retreat. Instead, I rested my elbow on the gate and let the breeze carry the silence a few seconds longer than was comfortable. "This property," I said finally, "is not part of Pinecrest Grove." "Oh," she said brightly, as if she'd anticipated this and practiced her retort. "Yes, we're aware. However, due to adjacent ecological risk." I held up a hand. "Stop." Their smiles solidified. "You have 5 seconds," I stated calmly, "to step off my property line and keep walking. At 6 seconds, I cease being polite." The man blinked. The woman swallowed. Both stepped back without waiting for the second count. They retreated down the road hastily, their pastel polos fading like melting ice cream. But their presence wasn't the point. They hadn't come to inspect. They'd come to test the boundaries, to see how far they could push before I pushed back. They received their answer. Just as the wind never blows from a single direction indefinitely, HOA pressure never arrives from only one angle. The second tap came that afternoon. Not on my gate this time, but on my piece. I had just sat down with a glass of chilled Sangiovese when the atmosphere shifted again. A shadow fell across my porch. No knock, no greeting, just a presence. And there he was, Gary Wilson, standing on the public sidewalk like a stone sentinel, awaiting permission to unleash his fury. Arms crossed, jaw taut, sunglasses on, despite the sun dipping behind the hills. He didn't speak initially. He didn't need to. He just stood there, letting me see that he had witnessed the volunteers' retreat, like a general surveying a battlefield after a scout's report. "Your attitude," he finally said, "is creating issues." "For whom?" I asked. "For the community." "That community isn't mine." "It affects you." "No," I corrected. "You are affecting me." His nostrils flared. A full, silent second elapsed. Then he stepped forward. Still technically on public ground, but close enough that I could detect the faint scent of peppermint masking stale coffee on his breath. "These inspections," he said, "will continue until you cooperate." "I don't cooperate with trespassers." "You don't get to choose." I raised my glass slightly, as if toasting the absurdity of his statement. "Gary," I said softly, "a man who believes he possesses authority is one thing. A man who needs authority, that's something else entirely." His jaw snapped shut. The remark struck deeper than he'd anticipated, probably because it was true. He took a step back, pointed at my land, and declared, "We'll be back, and next time it won't be volunteers." He walked off, his boots thudding like punctuation marks. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that I wasn't watching him leave. I was observing the phone in his hand, the way he kept checking it, the way he tilted it toward his chest to conceal the screen, the way his thumb hovered, as if someone was messaging him instructions in real time. And then it struck me. Gary wasn't operating alone. He wasn't the strategist. He was the instrument. Someone else was directing this. Someone who understood bureaucracy better than Gary ever could. Someone with something to lose. That suspicion solidified into certainty that evening when I checked my mailbox. Sitting inside, perfectly folded and centered, was a letter printed on thick HOA stationery, embossed logo, gold trim, signed at the bottom. Karen Matthews, HOA President. The contents were a masterpiece of euphemistic nonsense. Due to geographic adjacency and increased safety concerns, your property has been provisionally designated within Pinecrest Grove's expanded observation perimeter. Cooperative compliance is expected. Non-invasive assessments may occur as needed. Translation: we invented a perimeter. You're inside it. We're coming. I didn't crumple the letter, curse, or call an attorney. I simply folded it once, slid it into my evidence drawer, and poured another half glass of wine. Because now I knew the truth. Gary wasn't the storm. He wasn't even the thunder. He was merely the wind that blows just before the sky splits open. And the split was coming. The night everything shifted wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't even begin with a sound. It began with a shadow, a soft one, barely a ripple across the eastern row of vines. I was securing the tool shed, hands still on the lock, when I caught the movement from my peripheral vision. A figure crouched low, moving with just enough caution to believe he was being stealthy. I didn't shout or reach for the light. Years as an investigator taught me one rule. If someone believes they're invisible, let them. They reveal more that way. By the time I reached the fence line, the figure had vanished, slipped back over the ridge toward the road. But he'd left something behind. Jammed into the side panel of my exterior security camera was a small, black USB drive. Cheap plastic, unmarked, the sort of tool amateurs assume professionals use. I didn't touch it with my fingers. I used a pen from my pocket to lever it out gently, letting it drop onto a clean cloth. Back inside, I powered up my old investigation laptop, the one with no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, and zero tolerance for malware. I plugged in the USB drive. What appeared on the screen made my jaw tighten, not in surprise, but in confirmation. Malware, crude, yet dangerous to the untrained eye. A program designed to disable local cameras, reroute feeds to a third-party server, overwrite recordings, and grant remote live access. It wasn't the work of a genius, just someone arrogant. It had Gary's fingerprints all over it, even without a physical print. Most people in my situation would have deleted it, reset their system, perhaps contacted a lawyer. But fury leads to mistakes, and legal counsel moves slowly. So, instead of closing the door, I opened it wider. Right then, the honeypot took shape. Clean, simple, elegant. A trap tailored to Gary's ego. If he wanted to see something incriminating, I would provide an irresistible spectacle. I spent the next morning preparing the stage. I positioned a few crates near the back of the shed, stacked deliberately. My vineyard assistant, Tom, helped me lift several heavy sacks onto the truck's tailgate. We spoke in hushed tones, loud enough for a compromised microphone to capture, quiet enough to seem clandestine. The sacks were filled with powdered yeast nutrient, white as snow, high-grade organic fertilizer. Sealed boxes contained specialty wine reagents, all completely legal, entirely harmless. But under the right lighting, they could be misconstrued. Then, just as the sun dipped low, we executed the scene. I ensured the compromised camera had a perfect vantage. I stepped into the frame, lifted one of the sacks, and said, deliberately yet casually, "Make sure these are moved before sunrise. We don't want anyone asking questions about that white powder." Tom caught on instantly, a sharp kid. He nodded, playing his part flawlessly. "Got it, boss. No one will see a thing." perfect. I didn't overact. That's where amateurs fail. Gary wasn't seeking a Hollywood production. He was looking for confirmation of the narrative he already believed. A few half-heard phrases, dim lighting, suspicious movements. That was catnip for a man like him. When we finished, I locked the shed, extinguished the porch light, and let the cameras do the rest. Around midnight, the compromised feed would have sprung to life. I didn't need to see the monitor on Gary's end. I could envision his face perfectly. Eyes widening, breath quickening, ego igniting, the sudden thrill of believing he'd uncovered a major operation. Gary craved a victory, a significant one that would make him feel like a captain again, not a disgraced HOA enforcer with a fake badge. So I gave him a crime, a fabricated one, carefully staged, and he took the bait. That 12 flag-free AM, my router log flashed a new entry. A foreign device connected to my internal network. The same MAC signature as before. But this time, the connection persisted. 7 minutes, then 10, then 13. A man obsessed. Finally, at 10:02 a.m., the connection dropped. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet hum of the server filling the room. It was done. Gary had seen exactly what I wanted him to see. He would make his move next, and he would move too hastily. Because men like Gary, men who crave authority after losing it, don't verify facts. They don't double-check. They don't think. They act. And when they act without thinking, they march directly into the snare. My snare. The vineyard rustled softly in the night breeze. Somewhere out there, 5 blinking cameras stared into the darkness, believing they were the hunters. But the truth was simple. They weren't watching me. They were performing for me. Every step Gary took now, he would take with confidence. And confidence is the easiest vulnerability to exploit. There's a specific kind of knock that doesn't belong in the daylight. A night knock. Soft, uneasy, not intended to frighten but to implore. I heard it around 10:47 p.m., not at the front door or the porch, but at the side gate, the one no one uses unless they're disoriented or desperate. I set down my book, disengaged the porch light safety, and stepped outside. A figure stood just beyond the gate, one hand raised as if afraid to lower it. Pastel HOA polo, rapid breath, eyes darting down the road. Trevor. I'd seen him before. Clipboard guy, mid-30s, always perspiring through his collar at meetings. The kind of man whose desire to blend in made him conspicuously awkward. He flinched when the porch light illuminated him. "Derek," he whispered, "can we talk?" I studied him for a moment. He wasn't here for a confrontation. He was trembling too severely for that. I opened the gate and motioned him inside. He stepped across the threshold as if crossing a border checkpoint. "What's going on?" I asked. He wrung his hands, actually wrung them like an anxious child. "They're going too far," he said. "Gary, Karen, the entire board." I crossed my arms. "Define too far." He swallowed hard. "The surveillance, it's more than you know, more than they've told the residents." He looked like a man forcing himself to expel poison. I remained quiet, allowing him to speak. Silence is more effective than pressure. He continued, voice quavering. "Gary's been monitoring your property for weeks. Live feeds. He has a whole setup in his garage. Screens, notes, files. I saw it. I wasn't supposed to, but he left the door ajar when I dropped off paperwork." There it was, the first fissure. "What kind of files?" I asked. "Everything," he whispered. "Schedules, screenshots from your cameras, logs, even notes about your visitors. I kept my breathing steady, but internally, a cold wire tightened. And Karen, I said. Trevor glanced around my porch as if expecting an ambush. She knows, he said. She pretends she doesn't, but she knows. And Gary has leverage over her, something significant. He hesitated, his hand trembling at his side. That's why I'm here. I didn't rush him. After a prolonged moment, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a folded piece of paper, creased and damp with perspiration. He handed it to me with both hands as if it were hazardous. I unfolded it slowly. A password, a login URL, a note, internal cloud storage, do not delete. I looked up. He nodded frantically. It's Karen's, the one she uses for HOA contracts, vendor bids, private emails. There are files there that don't match official records. Missing funds, off-the-books payments. Some lead straight to Gary. A cold, quiet moment passed between us. He wasn't lying. He lacked the courage to fabricate so poorly. I refolded the paper neatly. Trevor, I said, why bring this to me? His answer was barely audible. Because the others. They listened to Gary. They're terrified of him, afraid of what he might do with whatever he has on Karen. His throat constricted. I'm afraid too, but I'm more afraid of where this is headed. Gary's unstable, Derek. He talks as if he still holds a badge, like he's the sheriff of some bygone frontier. He views you as a threat, a danger. He's constructing a case, a justification. He wants an incident, something substantial enough to warrant intervention. He clenched his fists, and Karen won't stop him, because he has leverage. She authorized vendor bids last year, illicit ones, double payments, kickbacks. If that surfaces, she loses everything. So she lets him run rampant. A wind moved through the vineyard, rustling the leaves like a whispering assembly. I observed the man before me, sweaty, terrified, struggling to maintain composure. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even particularly brave. But tonight, fear had driven him to honesty. What do you want from me? I asked. Trevor blinked rapidly, as if he hadn't planned that far ahead. I want it to stop, he said. I want someone to act, and you're the only one Gary can't intimidate. I released a slow breath. Trevor, I said quietly, you've just stepped into a very dangerous situation. He nodded. I know. Another gust of wind stirred the vines. You need to return home, I said. Act normally. Don't speak to anyone. Not a word, not a hint. Trevor, he swallowed hard. And Derek? And? Yes. I was never here. You never saw me. I held his gaze. For your sake, I said, that's precisely what happened. He slipped out the side gate and vanished into the darkness, his footsteps quick and frantic. I watched until the night enveloped him completely. Then I unfolded the paper again. The password sat there, inert. A key, a confession, a spark awaiting ignition. Gary wasn't merely watching me. He wasn't just harassing me. He was constructing a narrative. But now I held the first thread that could unravel his entire scheme. And I intended to pull it. I've been subjected to raids before. Authentic ones, with federal warrants, targeting drug dens. Those nights had a specific rhythm. Shouted commands, boots pounding pavement, the metallic clatter of gear when adrenaline outpaced his caution. This raid bore no resemblance. It began with an unusual stillness, almost peaceful. I was hosting a small evening gathering, just a dozen friends and long-standing clients. enjoying grilled fare under the arbor lights while blues music played softly. The vines whispered in the warm night air. The fire pit crackled. Glasses clinked. It was a good night, the kind I had built my life around. Then the lights arrived, red and blue, washing over the vineyard rows like a sky suddenly breathing lightning. 2 cruisers first, then a black tactical van grinding down my driveway, turning up a storm of dust and gravel. The music ceased. Every conversation died with it. My guests stepped back instinctively, hands rising slightly, eyes wide. I remained still, watching the vehicles halt, watching the doors fly open, watching the officers emerge, hands hovering near their sidearms as if briefed for a cartel takedown. A young officer stepped forward, his voice trembling just enough for me to detect. "Sir, we received a tip regarding illegal alcohol sales and potential narcotics activity on the property." Behind him, the tactical van's door slid open abruptly, and there he was, Gary, standing like a man poised to announce an unearned promotion. He pointed directly at me, shouting instructions to the officers I couldn't fully decipher, likely attempting to assume command, to claim the raid as his brainchild, to seize the spotlight he'd craved his entire life. I raised my hands just enough to demonstrate cooperation. Then I spoke calmly. "Officer, unless you're here for barbecue and Merlot, you've been misled." My guests released nervous snorts, a mixture of fear and disbelief. But the young officer wasn't the pivotal figure now, because from the rear of the group, pushing past 2 tactical team members, emerged a familiar face. Antonio Morales, intelligent, even-keeled. The sort of officer you want on a difficult night call. A man I trusted. His eyes scanned the scene. My friends, the food, the wine, the utter lack of criminal activity. Then he saw me. "Derek," he blurted out, "what's happening?" "Ask your informant," I said. Antonio turned to the officer beside him. "Who logged the tip?" "Anonymous," the officer replied, "but it came through internal channels, marked as priority." Antonio's brow furrowed. He knew precisely what that implied. And right then, Gary moved. He lunged forward toward the stack of covered barrels beside my shed. Barrels I had intentionally staged for the honeypot trap nights earlier. Barrels Gary had observed through the malware his associate had planted. He shoved past 2 officers, shouting, "It's in here. I saw him moving it. Open these damn sacks." "Gary, wait," I barked. Too late. He grabbed a box cutter from his belt, jammed the blade into the top of the nearest canvas sack, and ripped downward with all his might. A massive cloud of fine white powder erupted, blasting directly into his face. It coated his hair, his clothing, his gaping mouth. He stumbled backward, sputtering and coughing, as if he'd inhaled a confectioner's shop. I stood with my arms crossed. "Careful, Gary," I said levelly. "That's premium fermentation yeast. Inhale too much, and you'll cultivate mold in undesirable places." A few officers attempted to suppress laughter. A few failed. Gary wiped at his face, smearing the white powder into clown-like streaks across his cheeks. Rage distorted his features. "Arrest him," he screamed, pointing a trembling, powder-coated finger at me. "He's concealing narcotics. I saw the footage. I saw it." Antonio stepped forward. "What footage?" Gary froze, but only for an instant. The footage from his property cameras?" Antonio stared at him intently. "Gary, how would you possess access to his private security feed?" No response. Just the dawning comprehension spreading across the officers' faces. The silence deepened. thick enough to slice. That's a felony, Gary. Antonio's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Quiet authority strikes harder. Gary stammered, gesticulating wildly. I had authorization, HOA oversight. Emergency jurisdiction. No, you did not, Antonio stated. Two officers moved closer to Gary, not aggressively, but poised. My guests watched, silent. The vineyard hissed in the breeze. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to be heard. Gary, you walked into a trap. My trap. The only illicit activity here tonight is yours. The powder on his face rendered him ghostly, unhinged, defeated. Antonio finally nodded to his team. Cuff him. And just like that, the make-believe captain of Pinecrest Grove, the man who believed he could bully, surveil, harass, manipulate, and control me, was escorted across my vineyard under genuine police lights, hands secured behind his back, resembling a powdered confection consumed by rage. My guests began to breathe again. One of them whispered, "My God." I exhaled slowly. The trap had sprung cleanly, but I knew this wasn't concluded. Not yet. Gary wasn't operating solo, and the individual backing him was about to discover their turn was next. News travels swiftly in a small community. Scandal travels at light speed. By sunrise, everyone in Pinecrest Grove knew Gary Wilson had been led away in restraints, looking like a failed pastry chef. But they didn't understand why. They assumed it was a misunderstanding, an error. I intended to correct that. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours between 2 a.m. and dawn organizing the files Trevor had provided, printing logs, highlighting bank transfers, enlarging screenshots of Gary's illegal surveillance feed until they were poster-sized. At 8 a.m., I didn't proceed to the police station. I went to the edge of my property, right where the public road meets the HOA entrance. I erected a simple folding table, a podium, and a sign that read, HOA Safety Update, The Truth. I invited 3 individuals specifically: the editor of the County Gazette, the sheriff's deputy who held a grudge against Gary, and Trevor. But I knew others would come independently, and they did. Neighbors walking dogs, joggers, motorists who slowed to observe. Within 20 minutes, a crowd of 40 had gathered. I stood up. I didn't require a megaphone. The silence was sufficiently loud. "Morning," I said. "Most of you witnessed the lights last night. Most of you heard the rumors." I lifted the first poster board. It displayed a grainy, night vision photograph of a bedroom window. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "This," I said, pointing to the image, "is the master bedroom of the Miller family, 3 streets over, captured 2 nights ago. Mrs. Miller, standing near the rear, covered her mouth with her hand. And this," I flipped the board, revealing a timestamp, "was taken by a camera concealed in the community oak tree, installed by Gary Wilson, funded by your HOA dues." An angry, shocked murmur erupted instantly. "Gary didn't merely watch me," I continued, my voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. "He watched you. He compiled dossiers on you. Who visits, when you depart, who shares your bed." I dropped a stack of papers onto the table. "FUD. These are the logs, courtesy of an internal source who could no longer stomach the corruption." I spotted Trevor in the crowd, head lowered, wearing a hoodie. He offered the slightest nod. "But Gary is merely the muscle," I said. "Muscle requires funding." I lifted the second stack of documents. "Bank records." I said the name clearly. "Karen Matthews." Across the street, inside the HOA office, the blinds twitched. She was observing. Karen authorized security overtime payments of $4,000 monthly to a consulting firm registered to Gary's spouse. She authorized equipment upgrades that were, in reality, kickbacks for vendor contracts. I held up printed emails. Here she is, in her own words, instructing Gary to, and I quote, "find dirt on the vintner so we can seize his land for the expansion." The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were shouting. People turned toward the HOA office, pointing, extracting their phones. "This isn't a community," I said, looking directly at the office window, where I knew she was concealed. "It's a personal treasury for a failed officer and a corrupt president." I stepped back from the podium. The sheriff possesses these files. The state attorney possesses these files. And now, so do you. I left the papers on the table. By noon, 4 board members had resigned via email, claiming ignorance of the operations. By 1 p.m., a news van from the city arrived, and by 3 p.m., I watched Karen Matthews flee out the rear door of the community center, loading boxes into her vehicle like a common thief. She believed she could outrun the documentation. She was mistaken. The trap had captured the foot soldier. Now it was closing in on the mastermind. There is a specific time of day that career offenders dread most. It isn't midnight. Midnight is when they feel secure. Midnight is when they command the darkness. No, the hour they fear is 5 a.m., the hour of the wolf, the hour when sleep is deepest, defenses are lowest, and the warrant is signed. We called it Operation First Light. I wasn't part of the team that breached Gary's door. I'm a private citizen now. My credentials reside in a drawer. But I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the convoy of unmarked black SUVs glide silently past my vineyard, turning into Pinecrest Grove. No sirens, not yet. Antonio called me 10 minutes later to provide the details. At 5:14 a.m., the state attorney's task force breached the front entrance of Gary Wilson's residence. Gary didn't resist. For all his bluster, his tactical jargon, and imitation badges, when genuine door kickers arrived, he crumbled. They discovered him in his hallway, clad in boxer shorts and a stained t-shirt, attempting to force a hard drive into a microwave. He hadn't even powered it on before he was restrained and informed of his rights. But the arrest wasn't the disturbing part. The search was. What they found inside that residence transformed the case from harassment into a nightmare. In Gary's garage, his command center, they located the server Trevor had warned me about. But it wasn't merely logs. It was a shrine. Dozens of monitors, hard drives labeled by address, and on the wall, a floor-to-ceiling map of Pinecrest Grove and the surrounding area. Color-coded pins marked every home, blue for compliance, yellow for watch list, and right in the center, encircling my vineyard, was a thick red marker line. Inside the circle, he'd scrawled a single word, Target. But it worsened. Inside the master bedroom closet, they discovered an arsenal that would concern a cartel lieutenant. 3 AR-15s with obliterated serial numbers, a modified taser, illegally enhanced to dangerous voltage, and a crate of plastic restraints, flex cuffs, sufficient to detain a dozen individuals. He wasn't merely playing sheriff. He was preparing for a war that existed solely in his mind. If I hadn't set that trap, if I hadn't provoked him prematurely, only a higher power knows what he might have done with those zip ties. While the task force was dismantling Gary's life, another unit was pursuing the mastermind, Karen Matthews. She hadn't returned home after the public exposure. She had fled. But individuals like Karen, who have existed their entire lives within a bubble of petty authority, don't know how to vanish. They don't understand ditching phones, swapping vehicles, or staying off the grid. They panic. At 6:45 a.m., a state trooper identified a luxury sedan speeding down the interstate, 50 miles from the state line. When they initiated a traffic stop, she didn't run. She locked the doors and screamed. She screamed that she was the association president. She screamed about a conspiracy. She screamed until the window was breached and she was extracted. In the trunk, they located 2 suitcases. One contained clothing. The other held $140,000 in cash, funds drained from the HOA's emergency repair reserve mere hours before the accounts were frozen. By 9:00 a.m., the sun was fully ascendant over my vineyard. The SUVs had departed. The sirens had faded. My phone vibrated. A text from Antonio, concise and professional. Both in custody. Evidence secured. It's over. I gazed out at the rows of vines stretching green and serene toward the horizon. The dew was evaporating from the leaves. Birds sang. The observers were gone. The cameras were dark. The shadow that had loomed over my land for weeks had dissipated entirely. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted superior to any I'd had in years. But I knew one act remained. The arrest is merely the commencement. The true conclusion unfolds in a courtroom. And I intended to occupy the front row. Courtrows possess a specific odor: floor wax, aged wood, and anxious perspiration. It's a scent I hadn't encountered in years. But entering the county superior court that Tuesday morning felt like donning an old, heavy, familiar coat. The trial spanned 3 weeks. 3 weeks of jury selection. 3 weeks of high-priced defense attorneys attempting to portray Gary Wilson as an overzealous community guardian and Karen Matthews as a victim of circumstance. They endeavored to frame it around property boundaries. They tried to argue zoning regulations, but you cannot dispute video evidence. On the 4th day, the prosecution presented the footage from the honeypot night. The courtroom fell into dead silence as the jury watched Gary on the large monitors. They observed him skulking through the darkness. They witnessed him trespassing. They saw him compromising a private system. But the decisive blow wasn't the video. It was the audio. Trevor, nervous and shaking, took the stand and presented the recordings. The jury listened to Gary's voice, captured in his own garage, boasting to an acquaintance on the phone. Once I plant the evidence, the vintner is finished. Then we seize the land. Karen already has a buyer lined up for the expansion. Gasps echoed through the gallery. I sat in the front row, observing Gary's back. He didn't turn. His shoulders were hunched. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by the diminishing posture of a bully, realizing the principal is finally watching. Karen refused to look at anyone. She stared at her hands, weeping silently, performing the role of the vulnerable elder. It proved ineffective. Not after the forensic accountant took the stand and revealed the source of the $140,000 cash. It originated from the neighborhood's roof repair fund, the playground maintenance budget, the pockets of the very individuals seated behind me. When my turn to testify arrived, I didn't glance at the defendants. I addressed the jury. I described the drones, the cameras, the intimidation, the fear my neighbors experienced upon seeing an imitation police vehicle parked outside their homes at midnight. A home is meant to be a sanctuary, I told them. These two transformed it into a prison. The jury deliberated for fewer than 4 hours. When they returned, the atmosphere in the room felt electric. That heavy, static silence preceding a lightning strike. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for power abuse, requested the verdict from the foreman. I watched Gary. He trembled, genuinely trembling. On the charge of conspiracy to commit extortion, guilty. On the charge of aggravated stalking, guilty. On the charge of possession of unregistered firearms and weapon modification, guilty. The list continued. 18 counts in total. Then came the sentencing. The judge peered over her glasses at Gary Wilson. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice slicing through the room like a razor. "You once took an oath as a peace officer, and you forfeited it. Then you fabricated a fantasy realm where you could pseudo-abuse that authority. You terrorize this community, not for safety, but for ego. I sentence you to 24 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gary's knees buckled. His attorney had to support him. He emitted a sound, half sob, half gasp, that reverberated off the high ceilings. Then the judge turned to Karen. "Mrs. Matthews, you were entrusted with safeguarding this community. Instead, you treated it as your personal account. You financed a private militia to harass an innocent man. I sentence you to 18 years. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay full restitution of $450,000 to the HOA funds." Karen wailed, a sharp, ugly sound. The sound of a privileged life shattering against a concrete wall. But the judge wasn't finished. She struck her gavel once to quiet the room, then looked at the remaining HOA board members in the gallery. "Furthermore," she declared, "evidence has demonstrated that the Pinecrest Grove Homeowners Association has operated as a criminal enterprise. By court order, the current board is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. An independent trustee will be appointed to manage the community until fair, monitored elections can be conducted." The courtroom erupted, not with anger, but with applause. Sincere, sustained applause. My neighbors, individuals I'd barely spoken to for years, embraced one another. Some wept. The reign of terror had concluded. I stood, fastened my jacket, and walked into the hallway. Antonio was waiting. He didn't smile. He simply nodded. "Justice?" he asked. I looked back at the heavy oak doors, where bailiffs were leading Gary and Karen toward their new lives in 6 by 8 foot cells. "Yeah," I said, "justice." We exited the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, warm afternoon sun. The air tasted different out here, cleaner, lighter. It tasted like freedom. 6 months later, the silence returned to the vineyard. But it wasn't the heavy, watchful silence of before. It was the clean silence of growth. The silence of wind moving through heavy vines. The silence of a hawk circling high above, hunting for field mice, not for leverage. I spent the morning of the Harvest Festival walking the perimeter. The expanded observation zone was gone. The cameras in the trees were gone. I removed the final one myself, tossed it into the recycling bin, and watched the garbage truck compress it into scrap. The drones no longer fly. The neighborhood has transformed as well. With the king and queen of Pinecrest Grove serving federal sentences, the fear evaporated. People wave now. Genuine waves, not the nervous, over-the-shoulder glances. Trevor was elected the new HOA president. He didn't want the position. He attempted to flee when nominated. But that's precisely what makes him ideal for it. He disbanded the compliance committee on his first day. Now the HOA concerns itself with what it should, pool maintenance, and flower beds. I reached the front gate, the same gate where Gary had stood and demanded my submission. I drilled a new sign into the wood, crafted from solid oak with brass lettering. I made it myself. It reads, "Private property, surveillance in use. Sheriff's deputy, by appointment only. No HOA jurisdiction beyond this point." I stepped back and admired it. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. By sunset, the tables were arranged beneath the arbor. This time, there were no flashing lights, no tactical fans, no screaming men coated in yeast. Just friends, neighbors, even individuals who had previously been too fearful to glance at my house. The aroma of slow-roasted pork and wood smoke filled the air. Bottles of my finest reserve Cabernet were being uncorked. The sound of laughter, loud, authentic laughter, drifted upward toward the stars. Antonio Morales was present, off-duty, beer in hand, sharing a joke with Trevor. I observed them from the patio's edge. A young couple from the neighborhood approached me. They held glasses of my wine. "We just wanted to thank you," the woman said, for standing your ground. We didn't believe anyone could stop them." I smiled. "Vines possess deep roots," I said. "They don't uproot easily." As the night progressed and the fire pit dwindled to glowing embers, I tapped a spoon against my glass. The chatter subsided. 50 faces turned toward me. I raised my glass. The deep red wine captured the firelight, glowing like a gemstone. I looked at the land I loved. I looked at the people who were finally free to be neighbors once more. "To freedom," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet night. "To boundaries." I paused, glancing toward the empty road where Gary's Tahoe once patrolled, and to the profound satisfaction of never allowing small men to play at being significant officers. "Here air!" Antonio shouted. Glasses clinked. The sound resonated like a bell. I took a sip. It was the finest vintage I had ever produced. It tasted like victory.